All right. Recording. Cool. Welcome to Mocks and Stubs. Yeah, like I said, I really love teaching this lesson because it's like Mocks and Stubs are just such powerful tools, and we kind of decided we're going to put a little more emphasis on them in Mod 1 so that you all had exposure to them and could kind of continue to work on this like whole mocking and stubbing thing as you write tests and kind of do TDD at Turing. And yeah, like, so for example, like my Turing experience, we did not spend a ton of time on mocks and stubs, and I kind of like went into the job not really knowing how to use them. Like we talked about them a little bit, but we didn't like, there wasn't an emphasis, but they're such powerful tools for testing that we want y'all to not only be exposed to them, but like see the value in why we teach this lesson and why they're such like an important tool of testing. So yeah, the main things that we're going to work on today is like the why mocks and stubs, understanding the difference. They're not the same. And yeah, we'll practice with the Mocha syntax, and we'll practice creating stubs to help with integration tests, also known as practice. And yeah, that's it. So yeah, and then we'll kind of talk about like unit test versus integration test and the difference, and kind of like where stubs and mocks kind of like come in. And spoiler alert, it's generally like within an integration test. Cool. Any questions coming up to start? Like anything that like you had on your mind you want to talk about real quick before we dive in?
I guess there's a kind of a question going on in the chat that's just, and this is just clarity. I know the attendance is so brand new. Like when I saw that thread from, I cannot remember her name, but she posted about all of this, I thought it just said like for classes, even though it's like 101 is the cutoff. It doesn't say anything about like how students respond to that. And it says if it was like project work or PD time or something like that, then you guys would post a thread for attendance. So like the days that's where my confusion is that thread that was posted, and I think somebody pinned it, maybe I pinned it, but so that's, I guess there's some confusion about that.
And the confusion is around like how we will take attendance moving forward, or how it was taken today for the independent challenge.
The confusion is about how is attendance happening right now? Like what's going on? What do we need to do to make sure we're counted attended here?
Yep. Okay, cool. So yeah, so thanks for bringing it up. You are here as long as you are present in the Zoom room at 101. So if you are not present in the Zoom room at 101, then you are marked tardy. And then if you are not present by 30 minutes into the lesson, so by 1:30, then you are marked absent. And that's how it is for all lessons, like whether it's morning or afternoon. And for like independent challenges work time, we're going to be doing we post in the Slack channel, and then y'all respond to it by like 5 minutes into the work time or the challenge. And all of this stuff is like, it's not like we just started like trying to think of like ways to take attendance. Like we've been doing it for a long time, and we've been doing it just fine. The difference is that now we are in the process of accreditation, which the big thing with accreditation is it opens us up to loans, like government student loans and Pell grants and stuff like that that are not available to us currently. So, and the people that decide whether you get accredited or not, they are like they are sticklers on attendance. So we got to have the attendance policy like defined and the same across all cohorts and all mods. And as you can probably imagine, like mod teams, generally instructors have like little nuances. And so we're kind of like making the switch to like, all right, we do it this way now. And this is the way that we will do it from here on out. So that's kind of like the why behind it. And yeah, that thread that Pam posted in the channel, or that message, I should say, is like the source of truth. And if you have attendance questions, you can ping us on that thread. Yeah, hopefully that clears it up. Anything to follow up on that?
We'll just kind of keep an eye for that green check mark and just make sure we check that as well.
Yeah, so I just did that this morning because to be honest, I like wasn't sure how we were supposed to do it, and like I didn't get an answer in time. So I was like, all right, I'll do a Slack emoji because that just feels like the easiest way. But like for moving forward, it's always going to be a thread. So it'll always be like respond to this message. So like type something and you can type an emoji and that's fine. But that's like, yeah, just a heads up there. All right. Any Mocks and Stubs questions?
Yes, I hope they're more clear this time.
Same. And yeah, one thing I should also say is like, we don't expect y'all to be masters at this today. It's not going to be, this like is not going to be part of really promotion, I wouldn't say, but like it will be part of like the rubrics to get like a 3 and an exceptional and a meets expectations on the group project. And then I think it's like, I'm not positive on the rubric of the final project, but basically this isn't something we will test you on. It will be part of like the testing section of a project, of your projects moving forward, but it's not like something that is gonna like make or break you moving on to mod 2, just so you know. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff I want to get to, so let's jump into it. I'm going to put y'all into some breakout rooms, and I want y'all to answer these 2 warm-up questions. And it's basically like, hey, when have you come across a scenario that was hard to test or impossible to test, or you just couldn't figure out a way to write the test? And then can you think of any scenarios where a method would return like some value that was unknowable? So like you couldn't know what the return value is because something is happening in that method that changes the return value every time. Yeah. So let's see. Just want to make sure that someone has a partner. Great. All right, yeah. So let's answer those. They're under the warm-up section of the lesson plan, and we'll take like a couple minutes on this, 3 or 4 minutes. Okay, looks like we've got everybody back. I'd love to hear what some of y'all talked about. So let's hear from Ryan. What scenarios could y'all think of that were tough to test?
Sorry, I can't hear me. So we talked about testing random methods and how it's difficult to test random methods, and how Mike talked it through with me. There's like a YouTube video that we did yesterday that goes through that. And then Luke, what else did you? Can you help me here? What else did we talk about?
Yeah, the other one that Travis and I are running into is the issue of when you're running the test for like when the game has started, the way that we have it set up. It's hard to test it because you run the test and then the game plays, and you have to play through an entire game before it'll tell you whether or not anything failed.
Yeah.
Totally, totally, yeah. And so that's a situation where does the game require like input from the terminal? Yeah, so also requiring some user input there, something that we generally don't want to have to deal with. Cool, yeah, so let's hear from one more. Angela, what did y'all talk about?
We talked about how on both projects, once we get to iteration 3, testing becomes a lot harder because the first 2 iterations, you're just creating classes that don't rely on any input. So you can really follow TDD, but then once you hit that iteration 3, you write that runner file and start making methods for that. It's hard to even come up with a test. Like sometimes I can come up with a test, but then I realize I can't test it. And then sometimes you don't even know how to test.
Totally, yeah, and like part of the design of that is for you to run into that problem so that now when you're shown a tool that can avoid that problem, you not just like appreciate it, but have some context around like why this tool exists and why this tool can help. Cool. So thanks for sharing, y'all. Let's keep going. Yeah, so let's, if you haven't already, go ahead and clone this Bob Ross repo. And then, yeah, the one thing that you might need to run that you might not have already is this gem install Mocha. So just run that from the command line so that we have that all set up. And I'm going to switch over to it. Cool. Get rid of these.
Does it matter where we do gem install Mocha?
No, it shouldn't matter. It should install globally.
Do we need to fork this, or is just cloning sufficient?
Yeah, cloning's good for this one. Cool. And let me get something up here. Bear with me one sec.
And Tim, we would actually require Mocha in the test file, right?
Yep, so that's like, I was heading there, like once we have Mocha installed, then we can bring it in. We can bring in kind of like the mini test version of Mocha into our test file by, if we look here, we need to require this line here. So it'll be like require Mocha mini test, and that needs to be in our test file. All right, and so the first thing that we'll talk about is mocks. All right, so the first thing we're gonna test, like I wanna show you that this paint class is pretty basic, right? There's like a couple of things that are going on. Yeah, it's a basic object, and it's basically a paint that Bob is going to use in some way. And so if we bring up Bob and get the Bob test up. Cool. Yeah, so we can look and see, like, if we run this test, that's kind of like our first starting point. And we say, what's going on with this test? Let's see what I can find. If you notice, like, things are kind of slow, right? And like things are going at a pace that no one would really want to deal with if they were working with this repo and running the test suite like constantly, right? Like that took 12 seconds to run here. So that's like kind of creates a problem as far as testing, where we have the object creation of paint in this case is slowing down our ability to test Bob. All right, and so if we look here at paint, we've kind of forced this into action by calling the sleep method, which we talked about before. However, there are going to be times, especially in the professional world, where you have very expensive objects and you have expensive things happening on those objects. And you have objects like Bob that rely on those objects, all right? And so this is kind of the scenario where a mock kind of like makes sense as something to do. And I'll show an example of that here. So if I want to, yeah, the first thing I want to do is actually like skip the rest of these tests. Cool. So I want to skip these two and just focus in on test it can have a paint. All right, and so we see that this add paint method, this is kind of like a pattern that we've seen a lot, right? Like we are passing some object in and then we're adding it to our paints array when this method runs, right? So this is like not something new. This is something we've seen before, but the problem is every time line 19 and 20 run, when this is instantiated, unfortunately, this sleep 2 seconds runs and things are moving somewhat slowly. Let me see if I can get this one down there. Yeah, I want to be able to see all of them. Okay, so how are we going to fix this? Well, first thing I need to do is require Mocha minitest. So I will do that. I already have the gem installed, but yeah, so I didn't need to run that. And what I want to do is I want to create a mock of this paint object, because to test that my paints array is being populated correctly by the add paint method, I don't necessarily need a paint object. I just need to know that this array gets populated by this method, right? And so this is a time where I'm dependent on, you know, a paint object kind of in the real world. I know that I will want a paint object in here, but for testing purposes, I want this to run as fast as possible. And I actually don't want the expensive lines to run when I'm doing this test. All right, so I don't want these to run. So what I'll do is I'll just comment these out, and I'm gonna create paint one, and I'll assign it to a mock. So because I brought in this Mocha minitest syntax, I have this ability to mock things. And I'll just say this is, you know, a paint object, and paint object one is what I'll call it. Now, you don't need to pass this string here. This is like not necessary. This will work just like this, but it's a unique, it's like a string identifier that I can pass to like represent what this would be. And so I think what it really does here is it's helpful to see what I'm trying to mock. Like a mock can be anything, and a mock stands in for other objects. So in this example, I am mocking a paint object, and I'm saying I'm gonna mock my first paint object basically. So let's make paint object 2. And I'll make paint 2 this way. And so now what I've done is I've said, okay, I need 2 objects here because I call add paint and I pass them twice. And now what I've done essentially is I've created a dummy paint object that doesn't have to actually call into this paint class and initialize a real paint object. All right, so that's all I've done. I haven't done anything crazy. I've said, hey, I'm gonna take these real paint objects and I'm gonna mock them here with these dummy paint objects, all right? And so now, when I run my test, things run quite a bit faster, right? Like this ran in 0.001 seconds because I'm not relying on the expensive paint object to actually instantiate. All right, and so this is, obviously I'm forcing this with the sleep, but there is certainly a scenario where you have an object that takes 2 seconds to instantiate and run through all the code that it needs to run through. All right, and so we forced this on the paint one for the sake of the example, but like this is certainly something that happens in a production environment where you have an object that's expensive. the bulk of what you're trying to test here doesn't actually need this paint object. I just need to know that Bob can add paints and can retrieve paints when called. I'm testing Bob. I don't need actual paints here. All right, go ahead, Luke.
By expensive, do you mean takes a long time to run?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Is that standard language?
Yes.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Other things coming up in this mocking example.
While we're learning this, Tim, like, just to kind of, I mean, I guess it would be everybody's specific process, but like, does it make sense to just kind of have it commented out, like what it normally is, and then how you're mocking it, just so you can kind of keep track of like what you're doing?
Totally. Like, I think there's a number of things going on here. Like, I'm commenting this out because it existed already before, and it's like a quick like context kind of clue as to like what I'm doing here. The other context clue is what I called this, right? I called my mock something. And in reality, if I was writing this test from scratch, I probably wouldn't have this code here commented out. I probably would already know, like, okay, I want Bob to be able to add paints, and I don't want to use real paints. I want to use mocks, so I'm just going to have these, and I'm going to like kind of use my context clue of this string identifier when I pass it. And yeah, but I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, kind of, if you like this here, that's okay, leave it there to totally give you some context. Cool, I saw another hand. Yeah, John, go ahead.
Is there any visual, I guess, any visual way to see if it is working? Because
Totally.
yeah,
there is. Pry, right? Pry is life. So let's run it, and let's just see what paint 1 is at this point. It's a mock. It's a mock object, right? Looks like similar to a lot of objects that we've seen here with this object brackets and hashtag. But what is it? It's a mock, and this is a mock of paint object 1. Just so you know, like, I can call this anywhere, and I get a mock object with an object, a unique object ID. It's paint object 1 here because I called it that up here, right? So that's what I'd name this. So that's why it shows up this way in Pry. But at any point after I've required this Mocha mini test, now I have access to calling this mock wherever I want, right? And so that's what I did here in Pry, and you can see it returns a mock object right here. Yeah, so that's kind of like the way to visualize. The other way that you could visualize it is if I exit out of here and I put my Pry in this add paint method, right? Because that's where this paint is getting passed. And I call it here. Now, I forgot about this one. Let me exit. Now I hit this Pry and I can look at the paint, and indeed it is a mock object passed in that's being populated here in paints. If I exit again, now I can look at paints, because now I'm on that second time through add paint is being called. And now I can see my first object did indeed get into this array. And I can look here, and the paint at this point that was passed in is a mock paint object number 2. And I passed that in by calling add paint on 28, which caused me to get into this method. Is that helpful, John?
yes. I was just wondering because mine does come up mock, but it's still pretty slow.
Totally, because you probably didn't unskip these ones, or you probably didn't add skips to these 2 tests that are actually still like running these expensive methods, right? And so if these 2 run first, then yeah, you'll still have a slow one. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, thank you.
Totally. Nope. Good questions. Yeah, Arike, go ahead.
I guess one of my questions is like, when do you decide that the paint is the object that you want to mock and not Bob?
Totally. That's a good question. This probably feels a little bit uncomfortable right now. But we don't want to mock Bob because Bob isn't as expensive as paint in this case. So paint is the expensive object. Bob is not the expensive object. And we know that Bob will take in paint objects, but we don't need actual paint objects to test this specific method. So this specific method, I don't necessarily need a paint object to know that the method is working properly. So I am dependent on the paint object in like the real code, right? Like the real world code will have to run the expensive method and we'll have to like instantiate a paint. But in the testing scenario, I can use my tools to speed things up.
Tim, would it also be because like you're testing Bob in the Bob test, so you wouldn't want to mock Bob? Like paint is probably already tested somewhere as an object, right?
Totally. Yeah, paint has its own test, right? And this is like a good kind of use case where like, yeah, we wouldn't want to mock paint here. We'd want to spend the expensive, like, we'd want to like make this expensive and actually like run the test on the actual object. But because it is a Bob test, like we don't need real paints for this object. All right, so we can mock them to do what we want and still rely on our method that lives on Bob. So long answer, yes. There are some situations where in your test you might mock an object you're testing, but we won't get into those. Yeah, Saren, go ahead.
How is there a way to kind of like know? I guess I'm trying to wrap my mind around why is paint expensive? Like, and is it sort of as you go along and you start testing and recognize that it's slow, but are there any other indicators that would say like, okay, from the get-go, I know that this is going to be hard to like instantiate a new object every time in our test? Does that make sense?
Please. Yeah, totally. So you said it, you kind of figure it out as you go, right? You're seeing your test suite run slower and slower and you're like, oh shit, like I don't really want to have to use this object every time if I don't have to, but that's kind of something that you figure out on the fly. There's not like necessarily an indicator that you all are aware of yet. So a common pattern that would happen here is if there was like some kind of API call, which is like we're not going to talk about in mod 1, you'll talk about them in mod 2, but it would be like a call that is expensive and reaches out to some other server on the internet to get back some data, right? And that is an expensive process just because it's using the internet and it's like we have to like wait for a response from some server that we didn't program and that we just rely on. So in this case, like API calls are a good scenario where like you would recognize, ooh, I probably want to mock this call and not actually make the call, because another thing is like rate limits. So how many times you can hit an API generally is defined by their pricing structure. And so you wouldn't want to like every time you run your test suite hit this API, because then yeah, you're using up your calls and things get more expensive, like actually money wise expensive there.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. I'm gonna take Philip and then we'll take a break.
Just to be sure, the entire purpose of a mock is just to speed up your testing, or is there another purpose to using a mock?
So that's probably the main purpose, I would say. It's like use a dummy object that you don't actually need to speed up your testing. But like there's also a scenario where this one's like less common. Like I haven't actually run into it, but I can see how it could happen. You have, you're building a new feature for your production code. You have one team working on like a set of the feature or like a part of the feature that another team depends on, right? And we want to write tests, but maybe we're working synchronously and the stuff that we're building relies on the stuff that they're building and they're not done yet. What we can do here is we can mock what their object will do, what we know that their object will do in the future, but it's not quite there yet. It's not quite built yet. So we can just, if for our testing purposes, we rely on them, but let's just use a mock object that has all the functionality we expect them to have for the tests. Yeah, so that would be the other use case. Cool, let's take a break, come back at 40. Yeah.
Thank you, Porty.
Paint test that is essentially testing just the paint. And because now in our Bob test, we're really more specifically just kind of worried about all the different attributes of Bob, that the paint, because there is a separate class for it, is a little bit less essential. And so that's why we can mock it with just something that's just kind of a place filler while we're testing the essential things for Bob.
Totally, yeah, I agree with all that. Yep, cool. All right, I wanna show y'all one more example and then I wanna give y'all some time to practice. Okay, so I'm going to do this test it can return colors example. So I will get these pries out of here and focus in on paint colors, right? So we see here that paint colors basically maps over the paint objects, returns the color string that is there in the paint colors. And so if I unskip this one and I run it, let's get out of pry. Still expensive because I'm actually creating paints, but cool, it's working. So I've got a passing test, and this is kind of where I want to start with probably when I'm doing like mocks and stubs and all of this, is I want to start with the passing expensive test and then work in mocks and stubs so that I can speed this up, still verify the behavior that I want, all right? So I know that what I did up here will probably work down here, right? I had paint 1, paint 2, but I don't want those anymore. I don't want the real paints. I want to mock them. So I will bring in these mocks from my other test here. And cool, I've got those now. I pass those in and I call bob.paintColors and I hope to get this back, right? So let's run it. Cool, I get a failure this time. And let's read this very carefully. So it says test it can return colors. Okay, unexpected invocation on my first paint mock. So this looks like it happened the first time it hit one of my mocks and it tried to call dot color. All right, so which line in Bob is it, am I trying to call dot color? Anybody?
14.
14, correct. So it looks like when I get here and I call dot color, I get that error. So generally how we want to debug things, right? We want to put a pry in, check them out. So, all right, let's do some assumption checking. I assume at this point that @paints has my mocks in it, right? And not my actual paint objects, right? Am I safe to assume that? Everybody okay with that? Yep, okay, that's what I have in there. Cool. And now I'm mapping over this collection of paints. So where I'm at is I'm inside the block. So I expect paint to be mock 1. All right, all things good so far. And I want to call color. Huh. This is the same error I got in my test. So this is the problem. I can't call a method on a mock object where the method hasn't been defined, right? Like I haven't defined any method on my mocks, so they don't know what dot color is because they aren't real paint objects. Dot color is defined on my paint object right here. But I'm not dealing with real paint objects anymore. I'm dealing with mocks. All right, so here's where stubs can come in. And what I want you to hear first is that stubs run on objects. So they can run on mocks because mocks are objects, right? They're a mock object, but they are objects. So I can run a stub on a mock object. I can run a stub on a real object. All right, so if I was dealing with a real paint object, I can still run a stub because like methods, stubs run on objects, and stubs will take a method that lives on an object, or it will create a method that lives on an object, and then I control the return value. All right, so I decide what it will return. Okay, so if I want paint1 to have a color, paint1 is a mock. If I want paint1 to have a color method, then I need to stub that method out. So I can call paint1.stubs. You can see this .stubs runs on an object, right? This looks similar to our method syntax. And now it's going to take an argument of what I want that method to be called. So paint1.stubs color. And then I also am going to decide what the return value is right here in my test. .returns. And it looks like for this first one, we need alizarin crimson to be returned. So I see that that's what it was before. I'm going to put that right here as my return value. All right, so let's break this down one more time. Paint1 represents a mock object. .stubs, some special Mocha syntax for me to use to tell my object what method I want it to stub. And then when I stub a method, I need to give it a return value. And so indeed, I say it's going to return alizarin crimson here. All right. Now, if I run this test, what do we think is going to happen? So let's take a look here. I have paint1 stubbed for color. The last thing that happened is I got unexpected invocation for mock paint1. I want you to think to yourself for 30 seconds, what do we think is going to happen the second time I run this test? All right, so I'm going to take my pry out and I'll make this a little smaller, make sure you can see. What do we think happens? Now I've got my stub value for paint1. What happens the second time? Think to yourself. I'll shut up. Okay, let's use the raise hand if you think you know what's going to happen. Yeah, go ahead, Priya.
I'm guessing that you should get a similar error, but now for the paint2 mock.
I like it. Anyone come up with anything different than that they want to share? All right, let's run it. Cool. Unexpected invocation, mock paint2 dot color. All right, so looks like Priya was right. And I also get some satisfied expectations allowed any number of times invoked once, and that looks like for paint object 1. We're not going to talk too much about this right this second, but I want to show that it does exist. So now I need to essentially do the same thing and stub out my color method on my second mocked object, all right? Because all I did, my stub is only good for the object that it runs on, and it runs on paint1. And so at this point, I need to give paint2, my second mocked object, a stub method with a return value. So I'll do a Command C, Command V to quickly get that to copy. And what I'll do is I'll copy in Van Dyke Brown here and change this to paint2. And now with this setup, I think I should have a passing test, because when this color method runs for each of my mocked paint objects, I should get a return value that indeed does return what I expect here in my setup. All right, so let's run it. What is going on there? Cool. Indeed, I've got some quick tests, and I've got some passing tests now, which is where I started, right? I started with some slow tests. Now I've got some passing tests that are much quicker. All right. What I want to do is I want to take 10 minutes, and I want you to work in your breakout groups, but individually still, and I want you all to like use each other as resources. Feel free to share the screen when you want, but I want you to try to go through this process on your own. All right, and I want you to change for this final test it can total paint amount. I want you to change the paint objects to mock objects, and I want you to stub out the values that total paint amount relies on. I want you to stub out the methods and return the values that total paint amount relies on paint objects for. All right, so 10 minutes on that. Any questions about what I'm asking you to do? It's this final test here on Bob test. And I want you, so the easiest thing to do is like skip the other tests if you haven't already, so that they aren't taking up a ton of time. And if there's no more questions, or that there's no questions, I'll put y'all in there, and we'll take till like 2 for this. Looks like we've got everyone back. Cool. If you were able to finish that final test, can you put your hand up for me in the virtual hand? Thanks. Okay, great. Thank you all for volunteering to share. Let's hear from Christopher. Let's see some code from you.
Sure. So we'll do this one. Y'all see that okay?
Yeah, I've got it.
So commented out paint 1 and paint 2 because they're calling the expensive paint, and supplemented in the paint 1 equals mock, paint 2 equals mock, and then stubbed in. This originally was color, changed it to amount because 42 is not a color, and then returned the value that we wanted to equal 67. And so it does.
Great. I love it. Who has, let's have all the hands go down that were up. And then who has like questions about this? Who has like, you know, things they want to say about this implementation? Arike, go ahead.
So I definitely did not get this the first round, and almost barely got it this round. If we mock our paint objects, and then we stub that mocked object, does the name within the parameters for the stubs need to match a method that exists in the paint object?
No, it needs to match the method that is called from within the Bob object. So can you scroll down, Christopher, in the Bob class? So see how paint.amount is called? So that you have to think like that will be called on your mock in this situation. So we need, if we're reliant on something being called on our mock, then that is the method that we need to stub. It doesn't necessarily like have to exist on our actual paint object.
Okay. But this does exist in our paint object.
Totally. It does. But what we could do is have like a totally new method in Bob that calls, like we could do some new iteration called paint.brand, right? And just stub out the brand for our mocks. And then we don't have to add that to our paint class yet, because the mock is like, yes, it is standing in for the paint object, and it's a dummy object meant to stand in for the paint object, but they're not related, right? Like what you do in the paint class will not affect what your mock looks like. Your mock is intended to represent that paint class. However, if I had, you know, paints.each do paint, paint.brand, and or this would probably be a better example for like the color one, where it would be like a map paint.brand. As long as I stubbed out my brand for each of my mock objects, that code is going to run just fine.
That's definitely where I struggle conceptually between like, what do I mock versus what do I stub, versus returns versus expects. And but what you're saying is once I mocked it, it is now an independent object that's meant to mimic paint, but is not in fact paint.
Correct.
And so someone else could be working on, they could even like go as far as changing the name of this method. But as long as I like was with like my paint, the last meeting we had, you said I could expect that it would have this kind of like either attribute or method within it, and I'm expecting this to come back, that exists completely independent of whatever edits are happening over here.
Yeah, I would say
Sorry.
whatever edits are happening, like maybe on the paint object, because you still need
On
the
the
method.
paint object.
Yeah, you still need the Bob object method to like be the same, because you end up calling it down at the final like in the expectation of your test here. So like this one needs to stay the same, but like things can be changing over here at any point, and all you have to do is make sure you have like what exists, what you expect to exist on the paint object when it is complete, right?
I understand. Sorry, my annotate button was definitely covering Bob's. I thought this whole thing was paint. This whole side was paint, the paint object. But okay, we're on the same page. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, no, great questions. Cool. Let's hear from Travis.
Yeah, I was actually just brainstorming with my previous partner, Danny. So I realize this might be an oversimplification, but it seems like mock stands for substituting in a class. You're essentially making your own class, sort of. And then if that's true, then stubs could be, oh, go ahead.
You're making your own object.
Right, which, yes, right. Okay, so stubs you could use for a method or an attribute within a specific class. And if that's the case, then if we have user input within a method, if we expect user input, then we just do dot returns whatever we would like to have come back, so you don't actually have user input, and test that functionality is working.
Exactly, right? So the big things to hit on, I just want to repeat them. Mocks stand in for other objects, all right? So the idea is like, yeah, our classes are meant to provide the blueprint to instantiate objects. Our mocks are meant to stand in for those objects. Now stubs, what they do is they provide a way to kind of change the return value of some method on some object. So stubs run on objects, right? As we can see on lines 57 and 58 here in this test, stubs that like runs on an object, which in this case happens to be a mock. It could be any object, right? This stubs will work for any object. And then I need to tell it which method that could exist on this object or could not yet exist on this object that I want to stub out when it is called, and then I will return a specific value for this specific case in the test setup, in the test scenario. Cool, yeah, great question. All right, yeah, go ahead, Drew.
I'm assuming that you can add more than one stub to a mock in a test. Is that right?
Correct.
And then if you do, can you do it all in the same line, like amount, comma, color, and then in the returns pass it just like any other argument?
You might be able to do that syntax, but I wouldn't, because it slightly like complicates the readability for this, especially like right when you're starting out. Like there might be like some syntax where you can stub out like 3 methods and then as like arguments to to the stubs there. But I just wouldn't do that. I would do it like one stub at a time for one method at a time with one return value at a time, just to like be super clear for right now. Good questions though. Yeah, Leah, what's up?
So if you stubbed out, or whatever the term is, stubbed on a real instance of paint, not a mock one, would it overwrite what the value usually is?
Yeah, so let's try that. So I'm gonna have Christopher be our guide. So let's delete 54 and 55. Yep. And then let's comment back in 51 and 52. So now our paint 1 and our paint 2 are represented by real paint objects, right? But I'm stubbing the amount, and let's change the amounts that we pass in to our paint initialize. Yeah, so let's change those to like simple, like 10 and 20. So that we know that if we hadn't stubbed this, then it would be 30. But since we are stubbing this value, we should still get 67, and it should just probably take a little longer because we're using the real paint objects. So let's run this, yep. Perfect. So, yep, exactly kind of this use case, right? Like we're using real objects, stubs run on objects. They could be mocks, they could be real objects. And we're telling it, you know, hey, when the amount method is called on this object, you will return this specific value. And so it works on both. Yep, it works both ways.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep. Cool. I think that's all for questions. All right, cool. Yeah, I wanna. Oh yeah, Adike, go ahead.
Sorry.
You're good.
What if your? I felt like you sort of answered this question with just this last example, but what if your object that you're stubbing needs to hold another object? Would you just not mock it because at that point it's holding to? It's just doing too much?
I feel like that's going to be a nuanced scenario. That's going to be like you could go either way with that one. And it kind of depends on how much you need from that other object. And like, yeah, I'm not going to give you a definitive answer on this one because it just depends on the situation for that scenario.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, cool. Let's come back at 2:19. Thanks a lot for sharing, Christopher. Yeah, 2:19, we'll come back and then we'll jump into some more challenges.
Thank you,
219.
All right, it's 2:19, so let's come back together. Okay, so I already dropped this in the channel as like the user image generator challenge repo. It's the third link down in the channel. I also just dropped it in the chat. So we'll want you to clone this one down, kind of take a look at the setup, get familiar with it, take a look at the README, look what it's asking you to do. So for the first part of this challenge, we'll just focus on stubs, all right? So I want you to look at the image generator test and the image generator class, and I want you to add a test for the two methods in there that are not tested, generate images and then change max size. And I want you to do that by stubbing out the randomness that these methods rely on. All right, so I want to say that one more time. I want you to test these methods. The tests are kind of like already set up for which methods I want you to test, but both of them rely on randomness. So I want you to stub out the randomness that these methods rely on. All right, and so this is like, now we're getting into these scenarios that are gonna look pretty similar to the project. All right, and so that's like why I wanna work on this. And so we'll take like 10 minutes on this. It'll be same scenario, same breakout room. Where you can totally like talk and work together, share screen if you want, but I want both of you all to get the practice trying the typing together. So we'll take 10 minutes. where I'd like to see you all get to is a test written for generate images in max image size on the image generator class. We'll come back together and show how to do that after 10 minutes. And then we will, once I show that, then we'll jump on to the user test. And there's like some more kind of complex mocking and stubbing to be had in that. But let's start with the image generator test in breakout groups. Questions on what I'm asking?
Should we fork the repo first?
You don't need to fork this one. There are a couple forks here, and I did want to mention too, I think there's like a couple of the repeaters that did fork this. Looks like a bunch of you have now. So I've made some updates to Adike and Austin since you forked it last mod. So just like be sure to be using the updated repo is all I'll say. And you don't need to fork this. You can fork it if you want. And like the idea with forking it is like at any point you wanted, you could now make a pull request back to this repo and be like, hey, Tim, come look at my pull request. Did I do this right? And I can give you like feedback on that if you want to do that, but it is not required. Cool, so we'll take 10 minutes on this. The directions are in the README of the repo, and where I'd like to see you get to is image generator test, the 2 tests written, and the randomness stubbed out. Cool. Come back together at 2:32. Okay, so we've got everyone back. Did anyone get it that wants to like say, hey, I got it? Cool. Yeah, let's, thanks for volunteering to share, Carson. Let's see what you came up with.
All right, share my screen. So I only got through the test generate images, but it looks to be working, so yeah.
Okay, I see. Image generator dot max.
I got it like literally the last second, so I don't know if it's exactly right, but it worked.
I'm super glad that you bring this example up. So you are like certainly using a mock and a stub and like getting the syntax right. There's like a piece of this that's like less effective as testing this way, just because basically you're stubbing out a method that lives on an object, and you're telling it it's this return value, and then you are testing that same method call. So you're like basically testing that the stub works here, but this method basically would be better tested if there was another method that relied on this being some value. So this is like close, and it's like a good example to show like how you could like set up a mock and a stub, but then do your assertion in a way that's like just less effective than it could be. And like, this isn't like, I won't say this is wrong. I will say this is less effective than it could be. That's all. But thanks so much for sharing this. Anyone else come up with something?
I think so.
All right. Yeah, go ahead, Danny.
So what we did is,
can you share?
Oh yeah. Sorry, I forgot to push this. Yeah. So we're here.
Cool.
So we're going to using this method over here. So we want to stub that method. I don't know.
Yeah. So can you make this full screen and then zoom in?
Yes. Here, let me use my spectacle.
I would love to see that. Look at how quick that was. All right, now can you zoom? Yeah, just a little bit more. Yeah, okay, cool. All right, so.
Is that a method that you wrote, Danny?
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, so
yeah, how about Danny, you talk me through what's going on, and then I'll add when I think it's necessary, but I think I'll let
okay,
you take it.
We're wanting to stub the method, like the random number method, off of this generate images method here. So we're stubbing like the randomness, I guess, from that random method, and then we're returning. And we were kind of playing around with this at first. I think we just kind of picked just kind of like a random number that we wanted to return, because basically what we're doing is we've created this empty array that we're shoveling the images into using like the string interpolation from the image. So we know that it's going to return a string of the image plus whatever number it is. So image 0, 1, 2, 3.
Yep.
But it's returning it into a string. And then we're just calling it on the actual generate images from our test.
Totally. Okay, so a couple of things I want to hit on here. Well done. This is kind of like the leap that I wanted to see y'all make. So yes, Danny wrote her own method, and what she did is she isolated the randomness that was happening, right? So that rand parentheses at max image value was happening as like the first thing that was happening here, right? It's written here and when you start, and then it's also written here. And so what she did is create a method that basically takes the randomness and gives it a method name that now she can stub, right? And now she can stub this randomness out in her test, as she has done right here, or let's look at this one, as she has done here, and return a value that she can rely on here. And so the reason that this works the way we kind of want to see is because you've isolated the randomness, and what you've done is you've now taken methods that rely on that randomness, and you've basically made an integration test that relies on some value being stubbed, right? And so the reason this example like is more effective than the one that Carson showed us is because this method right here in isolation is called and is depended on by both generate images and assign unknown image value, right? So this is an integration of these methods kind of like coming together. So like choose random number being called from within both of these methods makes this like more of an integration test, and stubbing is generally a more effective practice when you have some method that relies on some other method in order to run. And here's a perfect example of some randomness happening that needs to be isolated first. And this was kind of like the leap of this challenge, is you have to isolate the randomness first before you can stub it out. And so that's kind of like the difficulty in this. Cool. Yeah, go ahead, Christopher.
Hey, so what I did was I took the rand, like the word rand out of the, and then just used that. Is that a less ideal way of doing it?
No. So let's show it. Let's show it just because visualization is always easier.
So yeah, random here and here, and so I just put random in here, and then that gives me the output that I want.
So this still works because now you're stubbing out you're not like totally isolating it into a method that you wrote, but you are isolating what is stubbed based on you saying whenever rand is called, and it doesn't even matter when rand is called with whatever arguments, we don't even care about the arguments in this case. Like whenever rand is called, hey, we want this back. And that is like, this is also an approach that works because you've still isolated the randomness by stubbing out this rand method that is called over in image generator. And so rand is like a Ruby method, but you can still stub out the value of a Ruby method from within your object that you created. And that's what you like essentially did here.
Cool.
Yep, totally. Like, as with many things in programming, there will generally be more than one way to solve this, but this is totally valid. I would say that I think the way that Danny showed is slightly better just because of readability. Like, it's slightly less abstract because yes, like I can clearly see you're stubbing out this rand method. So when this is called, this value 3 will be returned. However, it's one layer of abstraction away because like rand isn't a method that you wrote. So rand is a Ruby method that exists. So even the idea that you can stub out a Ruby method is slightly more complex than the idea that you can stub out a method that you wrote. So both effective, both valid. I would say the idea of stubbing out a method you wrote in Danny's example is slightly more readable.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So the isolation portion of this is for readability? Importance of isolation?
I would say, yeah, the importance is readability, because like you can do it, you can stub out a method that isn't isolated, but it is more effective. Plus, the idea would be like, say in Battleship, you ask for user input a couple of different times, but what you do to that user input is slightly different based on where you are in the program running, right? So if I need like maybe like a gets.chomp.up case, I can isolate that into one method. If I need like a gets.chomp.split, I can isolate that into one place. Or I could say, I just want to isolate gets.chomp into one place, and I want to stub it out with a certain value one time, and then I want to stub it out with a different value at a different point in my test. But if I just stub out gets.chomp, if I just stub out the gets of it, then I will only be able to ever stub it out with one value. Whereas if I isolate the method into being a method that I wrote, then like at different points, I can kind of like stub out the value to be different things.
I got a question too.
Cool.
So I tried to kind of change my test based on what I saw from Danny and Carson, and so now it passes, but I'm not sure. I feel like it shouldn't pass, but it is passing. So maybe
you want to share
yes,
it?
Can you see there this one?
Yep. Okay.
Okay. So so the reason why I feel like I don't know why it's passing is because here is a I'm going to the attribute, right? Max image size, but I feel like it should be something generate images.
I see. Okay. So the best thing to do here is pry in and see what's happening. So let's pry in just below, between lines 9 and 10 of image generator. And can you zoom in like a slightly?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let me close that and then. Is that better?
Yep, that's better.
Okay, so 9 and 10.
Yeah. Cool.
So now just right?
Yep. All right, cool. So at this point, generate images has been called. So in our test, we are on line 28. Generate images is called. We come into this method and we hit the pry. And at this point, image generator.stubs max image size and returns this image 0 string is what's returned. All right, so let's make sure that max image size is this string. Let's check.
I added this break line, by the way. So what do I do now? Max image. Okay.
Yep, max image size.
Sorry. size. Okay.
Cool. So it is indeed our stubbed value. Now let's see what rand and then max image size produces. So let's run line like 11, but stop before the dot times.
So I need to go down with my pry, right?
No. So you can run it in your pry. So let's just copy in right here.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Nope, so just up to where the red line is and not the dot times. Yep.
Okay.
Cool. And then you exited your pry, so we need to rerun the test. Cool. All right, so let's see what that produces. Okay, some random value, right? So and then let's run it again. Run it one more time.
So I need to exit to run it again?
No. So just hit the up arrow and run rand. Yeah, run that again. See, so this is producing a random value still. So it looks like rand can take a string, still produce a random value. The reason that you're getting this only to run once is because it doesn't matter how many times this is set to run, you added this break right here.
Yeah.
And so that first time that it runs, it breaks out of there, and we can depend on no matter how many times it said we were gonna run, it runs once, breaks out, and images is indeed image 0.
What I did was like I looked at so what I ran it and then it showed like 2,000 something images. So then I grabbed the first one, and then because I knew it was gonna come out, and that's why I put the break. So I was to catch that one. Makes sense. But that's what I wasn't sure.
Totally.
Like,
Totally. So what we'd want to change here is we'd want to change what we're returning, and we'd want to change what we're stubbing. So we'd want to stub rand, and we'd want to return a number that we can depend on here. Is kind of like,
for example, like 1,000, right?
Yeah, exactly. But then the problem is then you'd have to set up your assertion to be like 1,000 images. So you'd want it to be like a reasonable number, like 2, I think would be better.
Oh, what do you mean? It wouldn't be like this, like here?
No. So Nico, how about this? We can like talk more about this after class.
Sure.
But I want to like move on.
No, of course. Yeah. I don't mean to take over. Yeah.
I think what he was saying, Nico, is that you're just putting in, like, you're passing an argument of just any random number that you want to see if it's working the way that you want it to work. So like 2 or 3
exactly.
or 4.
Honestly, I don't understand it. Like I noticed that and I was like, oh, if I put this one here, see if I can catch it. And I caught it, but I don't quite understand why it was working. That's why I was asking for help.
Totally. No, I'm glad you did. And yours is working because of that break statement you put in there, not necessarily because you stubbed the right thing or returned the right thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Christopher, go ahead.
I apologize. I just slid my hand up.
Oh, yeah, you're good. Cool. We're almost out of time. I kind of want to pivot and just like show you some more examples and walk through this. I think one more time. I think it's worth seeing. So yeah, let's go to image generator and I'll walk through this. So first thing we have to think about is what we are actually testing. So for this generate images method, I know that it will run some random amount of time and generate some random amount of images. They're not actually images, they're just strings, but we can think like maybe this is how random GIFs are generated at some point, and we don't know how many will be generated, but this is the randomness that will run, and what we actually care about is this images array that's returned, right? So I know that I care about my return value being an array, and I care about it happening a certain number of times that I can't really predict at this point because it's random. So the first thing that I want to do is probably change my code around to isolate the randomness. All right, and so I can do this by refactoring slightly, and what I'll do is cut that and I'll call this some random number, and that will be my method name. So now I will say some random number, and I'll put my randomness in here, right? So that to me looks like now what I've done. In this case, all I've done is I've isolated the part that is random. You can also do this with user input. You can just isolate the part that is user input and make it your own method that just does this one thing, right? This method is super simple. It just does one thing. So now what I want to do is test this. I'm not sure what that is. Sorry, y'all. I don't know why it's like this weird thing came up. Okay. Okay, cool. So I need an object, right? I need an image generator object, so I'll start there. And then I know that I have this some random number method that my image generator object is going to need to stub out, because I got to stub out the randomness. So I will write it, and I will say image generator dot stubs, the name of my method that I wrote, some random number, and a value that I can depend on being small so that I can write my test in a way that makes sense. We'll say this returns the number 2. All right, and so now I have, I can assume that this will be, instead of a random number, this will be 2. So I can assume that 2 dot times do num will run, and so 2 times through, this image will be added to the images array. So, all right, I can assume that. So I'll say assert equal, and I'll set up my array. This will start with image 0, like that. And then the second time it'll be image 1, because we start counting from 0 in programming. And then I will call the number that I'm trying to test. Or I'm sorry, the method that I'm trying to test. Right? So let's break down what I'm doing here. I'm stubbing out a value. I'm stubbing out the randomness, and I am basically stubbing out this some random number which generate images relies on. So generate images as a method relies on another method. So we can think of this as like an integration test, all right? When methods rely on other methods to do something, you can think of that as like, that's an integration test, all right? So I've got this set up like this. I feel pretty good about this. I think this will run. And so let's try it. Cool, it didn't run, so I did something wrong. So let's see what it was. Oh, I accidentally called some random number here instead of generate images. So I can see here that I got a value of 2. What I expected was this hard-coded 2 strings. I need to call the right method that I'm trying to test. Great, and now I get a passing test, right? And so this is a way that we can stub out randomness in order to test methods that rely on it. All right, questions about this? Yeah, go ahead, Angela.
So when you say stub out randomness, do you mean just randomness, or do you mean stub out the method that you want to like bypass or overwrite with?
Yeah. In this case, I mean both. So in this case, I'm stubbing out the randomness, which also happens to be this some random number method that I wrote. That is what calls into the randomness. So this is like a way for me to like know that I've isolated the randomness, and I can stub out this method that I know just returns the randomness. But what I can do is I can say like, hey, when any method calls this method, give me this number, and then I'll be able to like depend on it.
I guess my confusion is whether isolation is important just for randomness or just in general for stubbing.
I would say in general for stubbing, it will make your stubs more readable. And some things that are generally like things that you'll want to stub out are like randomness and user input.
Okay.
Yep.
I think it kind of goes along the lines too, like TDD, right? The smaller chunks you can create like individual tests for, it makes it a lot easier when you're like running your actual class to like kind of going with the whole isolation word, like isolate what it is that you're doing. So it's like with TDD, you're trying to encompass one, that test should be just doing one thing.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good kind of follow up on it. Is like the smaller our methods, right? The less our method is doing, the easier it is for me to stub out that value and then depend on that. Cool. I saw Philip had his hand up.
Sorry. In the case of trying to sub out the randomness of user input, would you then like create a method, call it like user input, and then the actual like within the guts of it, you would say like just whatever you're calling user input equals gets.chomp?
Yep. So in this case, like I've isolated the user input to just be the gets.chomp. And now what I could do is I could stub out my method called user input. And I can just return whatever I want here. This could be like a P, it could be a Q, it can be whatever I want.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Cool. Other questions coming up?
Will in general, we will in general have to create a helper method just for this. So for example, in this case, we were trying to test generate images, and it was, and then, but we needed to create something else just to make it in this particular case, or is in general that is going to happen, do you think?
That's going to be kind of like case by case. This particular case, I created my own method so that I could do two things: make my stub more readable to be like, I'm not stubbing out a Ruby method, I'm stubbing out a method I created, and to isolate just the randomness piece of this, right? And just have randomness be one method that I can then stub out, and then I can just rely on the return value of that method when I need it. Cool. Yeah.
Can you put back what you had originally? Because I'm having a hell of a time getting mine to work.
Yeah. So like this.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong here. Are you able to? Can we look at mine real quick?
Yeah, totally. Let's wrap for today, like for the lesson. If you got a hard stop at 3, hey, we finished on time. Thanks for being here. Thanks for the engagement. One thing I wanted to add too is like this, you can think of this entire repo as your Mocks and Stubs like Ruby exercise repo, right? Like the entire user test has a ton of comments of like, hey, this is why I'm doing this. Oh, let me now explain line by line each thing that I'm doing in here with some examples. And then there's also some tests that aren't written that you can go write for practice. All right. So this is like your Mocks and Stubs Ruby exercise. So I want to also say that. Cool. If you want to stay, stay. If you need to go, go. And yeah, see you later. All right. Yeah, go ahead, Travis.
It's given me 2.
Well, you have rand C on line 14. You need to take the first part of line 14 out.
Son of a.
So just take out rand and then your argument that you still want the times do number, but what you're going to put there instead is like some random number dot times do versus at rand.
Yep.
Ew.
Good eyes, Danny. Yeah, it's totally because you're still relying on some randomness in the other case. So that's like, yeah, that's totally. Yeah, and there's some moving
That's
parts
the part
here.
I missed.
Yeah, and there's like a decent amount of moving parts here. So like totally, totally a valid kind of like thing to overlook there. Cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing.
Sweet, thanks, Tim.
Yeah, thank y'all. See ya probably tomorrow.
Tim. Dude, that last 10 minutes was crucial. Like I didn't understand any of that up until the last 10 minutes.
And that's why I did it. That's why I was like, let's do this one more time, and I'll
really
do the
glad you
example.
did. Yeah.
So yeah, no, I'm glad I did too. Thanks for that feedback. Appreciate it.
Hey, Tim.
Yeah, what's up?
Hey, so would he also remove the at rand from the change max size?
I don't think he needed to in that case, because he isolated the rand at max size, right? And then called it that number, or called that method that he used to isolate, and then that rand at max size is like basically doesn't matter for our test. So do you want to share and like talk about something on your screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
What did I do?
Cool.
Okay. So I ended up taking the one that was down here also.
Yep,
There was,
totally. Yep, I like that. This is like the part that I didn't get to, but I would have done exactly that, where I have like this method calling random number as well.
Okay, that was my only question.
Yeah, so let's look at your test run, right? I assume.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think like, yeah. Okay. Cool. So yeah, you're all good. Yeah, and the idea then is exactly this, right? That's why there's two examples in that method. So now anywhere where previously my method like relied on some randomness, it's like, nope, now I've isolated the randomness and now I can stub it out wherever I need to.
All right, good stuff. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, of course.
Good one.
Cool. Nico, did you want to? Nope, doesn't look like it. All right, see you guys.